live like the gospel's true. How should we live? Live like we're justified through faith. And secondly, live like the gospel's actually true. Verse 17, Paul says, "But if, in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we too were found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor." So at first this is sort of confusing. You read that and go, what the heck is Paul saying? Now, through studying this, through praying, this is what I think Paul's getting at. I'll read it to you. I've written it down because it's kind of confusing to me. Maybe it's confusing to you as well, but I think this is what Paul's saying. He's saying, if we're justified by the grace of God through faith in Jesus, does that mean it will lead us to keep sinning? If we're not justified through our works, but we're justified through faith, does that mean we're not going to work for God and we're just going to sin all the more? Does our justification through faith lead us to be lazy and disobey God? That's what he's getting at. And he says, certainly not. But the big idea of this, Paul's trying to correct an error. He's saying, people who try and use the grace of Jesus as an excuse to keep living in sin are proving they don't truly know Jesus. Because some people would say, well, if you tell people they're saved by grace through faith and not their works, they're just going to go and keep sinning and keep sinning and keep sinning. You need to tell them that God will love them and God will approve of them if they're very good. That's just not true. If you truly meet Jesus and you truly understand and live in the freedom of Christ, you know that He's justified you by grace, you're not going to want to keep living in unrepentant sin. When you sin, you're going to want to turn. When you fail, you're going to want to turn because you've seen who Jesus is and you love Jesus. So justification through faith and not works doesn't lead us to keep sinning. And those who would use salvation by grace through faith as an excuse to keep sinning, they're proving they don't really know Jesus. Our justification before God is not an excuse to keep sinning. It's an empowerment that we are accepted to God. So now let's live in the way that God says is right because we love Him. We're supposed to live like the gospel is true. Jesus is not a servant of sin. Rather, Jesus gives us everything that sin could not. Sin promotes or promises joy. Sin promises that it will be good and it will be joyful, but it doesn't deliver. It never delivered. Be honest with yourself. Sin always promises joy, but it never delivers. And it will never deliver. Sin brings fleeting pleasure, but not true lasting joy. It feels good in the moment, but guilt and shame it comes afterwards, and we know it doesn't last. That's why people keep doing it. It doesn't last. Jesus promises joy in knowing and obeying Him, and He does deliver. Jesus promises that we are created for Him, that knowing Him personally and obeying Him, that's what produces joy, because that's how we're wired to live. As the psalmist says in Psalm 16, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." And the Apostle James says in James 1:25, "But the one who is no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be joyful in his doing." So the big idea of the psalmist and of James is that what brings the fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore is truly knowing Jesus. That's what the psalmist says, Psalm 16:11. "In your presence there's fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." And then James says, the one who looks to the truth of the word doesn't just hear it and forget, but is a doer who obeys God. He said he will be joyful in his doing. So sin is the killjoy. Obedience is what produces more joy in Jesus. Sin promises it won't deliver. Jesus promises joy, and He does deliver. So the whole point here, what we need to understand is we're created by Jesus and for Jesus. He's the one who gives us lasting joy. We need to also understand, get this, we need to understand that every time we're tempted to sin, we are being tempted to disbelieve the gospel. We're being tempted, when we're tempted to sin, we're being tempted to disbelieve the gospel and to live as though it's not true. Because that's why Paul says Peter's conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. He was living as though the gospel weren't true. And every time you're tempted to sin, the temptation is Jesus isn't truly the one that gives you joy. Knowing Him and abiding with Him, obeying Him, that's not what brings joy. When you're tempted to disbelieve that and to believe this thing, whatever it is in front of you, this will give you true joy. So know that as you fight temptation in your life, as you battle, as you wage war against your sin, know that every time you're tempted, it's a temptation to disbelieve that Jesus is our joy. That obeying Him and knowing Him is what truly produces a well of life in us. We need to live as though the gospel were true, because it is.